Hello, Christ Church, Calgary. It has been so long since I have stood here. Yes, somewhere around 35 years. Where has the time gone? Brandon, thank you so much for the invitation and the privilege to be with you for this Thanksgiving celebration. You know, it's magnificent always to come into a church on Thanksgiving with the air full of the sense of the harvest, with fruits and vegetables and colors and autumn colors and fruit flies and, you know, all the things that come with it. The glory of the harvest has come in to the church, and it signals, of course, our deep connection to the land and our dependence on the land. Anthropologists would point out that virtually every agrarian society at the time of harvest will always mark some celebration, some ritual of Thanksgiving and feasting because there's enough food to survive. Canada is a harsh geography. Douglas Todd has this expression, Canada's never user-friendly, particularly user-friendly. And then I love the text by Peter Newman, his observation that the Canadian shield is the only shield in the world that doesn't shield anybody from anything. The people of this land, indigenous and settler, learned early on that the only way you survive in this land is to survive together. And that's the notion at the basis of the wheat pool, of universal health care by act of parliament, and all the other benefits that we share together. And if one of the outcomes of the threats to our sovereignty that we've heard this year repeatedly is to have that foundational characteristic of who we are as a Canadian people reinvigorated by a collective determination to survive together, then well and good. We will find reliable trading partners. We'll put a port in the north. We will reduce the interprovincial barriers, and we'll eat the food that we grow. Anyway, let us note that the uniqueness of this day is that we have brought the creation before us and into our place of worship. And God knows that is an important thing to do. Let me tell you a story. So, 35 years ago or so, I was down the street that way towards the Glencoe Club at Olga House, which at that time, the building in the corner, was the office of the Anglican Diocese of Calgary. And your rector, Barry Curtis, just a year before, had been elected as our new bishop. And I was there, I can't remember why I was there that particular morning, but the place was full of clergy types. Some meeting had just ended. And I saw through the crowd, I saw him, Herbert O'Driscoll. I had first encountered Herb in 1979, just after I was ordained, at a conference in Banff where he was speaking. And I sat mesmerized as he opened up familiar pieces of scripture and filled in background and brought in details and hunched at human inclination and feelings that might have been taking place, and then wove into it news items and pieces of poetry, a little Shakespeare here. So it just was so expansive, almost like the window that is there. I looked at this morning, which is the first time I've seen it in place, and it just kind of is expanded. That is Herb, indeed, because he would give you scriptures in a way that were suddenly relatable and universally applicable. It spoke to your own life in a fresh and remarkable way. Anyway, at the time he was dean of the cathedral in Vancouver, and an internationally sought-after speaker. He had a daily radio show down the coast, and author of multiple books and hymns, who then went on to Washington, D.C., where he served at the helm of the College of Preachers for the Episcopal Church of the United States. Remarkable. And then came here to you for 9-10 years with Paula and her artistry and banner making and liturgical art and her voice as it joined the magnificence of the choir. It was a magnificent moment. And so I'm down at Olga House, and Herb and our eyes have met, and he raises his hand and points his finger at me and says, "You and I are going to have lunch." You could do that in those days. It was 1986. Gosh, that sounds like a long time ago. And, you know, Rondi and I had 2 kids and 2 dogs and 2 cars and 2 careers, and we came here for 5 magnificent years with wonderful lay leadership and opportunity and creativity, and all with Herb leading the way. And I like this story. If you were here during those days, you will remember, which happened with some frequency, and Robert Pinn, Dean Emeritus, who is here also, and served with Herb in Vancouver at Christ Church during those years. Maybe this happened for you too, Robert. But, you know, we'd be at the back of the church, main service, Sunday morning, everybody lined up, crucifer, acolytes, candles, choir, clergy, etc. No Herb. And I'm at the back and I'm looking around always. And then, you know, the note goes up to Margie Newman to start playing the processional music, the congregation stands, crucifer starts, everybody's moving along. Okay, let's go, we're in the parade. And I come up the aisle and I sort of acknowledge the cross, and then go into my prayer desk and sit. No Herb. 3rd verse, 4th verse, last verse. And the door opens and Herb would come through and he'd walk in very calmly. He'd come in, acknowledge the cross, go to the prayer desk because it was in the reverse then, sit down, and I'd be standing over here with him, holding on to my hymn, and Herb, I swear, he would look at me and say, he'd never said it, but he looked at me and said, like, gotcha. Anyway, it is wonderful today that Paula O'Driscoll is here, has come in from the coast, from Victoria, and is here with their grown adult children, Niall, Deirdre, Moira, and Aaron, and significant others and grandchildren, who are here for the dedication of this window in honor and in thanksgiving for that ministry that we received from Paula and Herb during those years. It's a dream that arose, actually just last year was, in January and December, and then was led throughout by Barb and Mike Morin, and then overseen by Fritz Panicook and Catherine Evamy with the Window Committee, and then the exquisite art and artistry that was done by David Hake and his son Crosby at Rubaiyat Studios, and many, many others who made this possible, which is more than a window, it's actually a message to us and to the future. I want to read some words that Herb wrote in January of last year when this idea was just being presented. As you know, the thought of this window came from a decade in which Paul and I and the congregation, because it takes all 3, developed a ministry that was spiritually satisfying. Our marriage has always been a shared one, as was true of that decade. I carried out the role of rector in worship, preaching, and pastoral care, and Paula immersed herself in the already magnificent music of Margie Newman's choir and her recitals. Now we are in 2024, in a world that has changed in so many ways, even in the fleeting decades since we left, which is more than sufficient time for Herb O'Driscoll to become Herb who? End quote. He really wasn't sure at the beginning about having a window. And then as the idea grew, then he offered a vision of what might be done and the message that might be conveyed. And with 3 images that he gave us and to the artists. The first element comes from the 14th century Christian mystic Julian of Norwich, who lived at a time of catastrophic plague that eventually became named the Black Death for the millions that it killed across Europe and through most of England, that just ravaged the countryside. And you can imagine, I mean, we've just lived through a pandemic, but you can imagine then the sheer panic, the economic and social disruption that would have taken place, the foreboding of what was coming upon the earth, and doomsday predictions that the world was coming to an end. And then in a small church near the coast of eastern England, Norwich, named St. Julian's, in a small room on the northwest side of that church, a woman of prayer lived. We don't know her real name, so we call her Julian because of the name of the church. Around 30 years of age, after surviving a very severe illness, which somehow may have been related to the plague, she experienced a series of dramatic visions, clarities in her time of prayer, which she then scribbled down and then became a book called Revelations of Divine Love, which incidentally is the oldest surviving English language work by a woman. In one of the best known of her visions, Julian sees in her hand a tiny round hazelnut, and then puzzles and wonders and expresses, because it's happening in the midst of a prayer, God, what does this mean? And the knowing that she receives is God saying, Julian, this is all that is created, the totality. And she marvels at this symbol, this tiny round hazelnut, that it could represent the whole of creation, the whole world at a time of such disarray and fear. And then the wonderful assurance comes to her, and all will be well, and all manner of things will be well. That's the first image. The second one that Herb gave was from 1969, when the commander of the first Apollo mission to the moon, Frank Borman, pointed a Hasselblad camera outside the portal of the spacecraft and caught the photograph of the jeweled blue and green and white of the Earth rising above the desolation of the lunar surface. Earthrise, which was the first time that we saw the magnificence and beauty and the fragility. It is all that has been created. And third, Herb said, and I'm quoting here, the reason why those two images are so important and so extremely suitable for this time is that the voice of Julian expresses the deep hope that we all are desperately anxious about today, the future of our very planet. And if the artist can put together those three elements with the promise of Julian, then you have orchestrated in stained glass a piece of 21st century art that brings home to everyone who sees it what is being called by many creation spirituality. End quote. That's March of last year. So if we look at our Thanksgiving bulletin on the cover where we see this image of the window, you notice it is rich and colorful like Paula's art. It is cosmic and expansive like Herb's preaching and teaching and writing. The sun, the moon, and the stars is an echo of St. Francis, which Herb so often quoted. And as our book of prayer puts it right in the center of it, this fragile earth, our island home. And then in the lower right, you see Julian's hand rising into the scene, holding a tiny hazelnut with the words appearing beneath, and all will be well, and all manner of things will be well. Isn't it interesting to notice how much of the Bible happens outside? And how often it was that the people that we read about in the Bible, as they encountered God or God encountered them, it was happening outside in places they least expected it. Under an oak tree, by a riverbank, in the desolation of a wilderness, on the tops of mountains, underneath the starry skies, in the face of a complete stranger. And then when people wanted to know more about God and asked Jesus, Jesus said, well, look at the lilies of the fields. Look at the birds of the air. Look at the women who are kneading bread. Look at the potter with the clay. I love Barbara Brown Taylor's expression, all the ways that the sacred is hiding in plain view. What we do here weekly is prepare ourselves to go out into the week and to notice God in everything, and to hear the divine voice that can speak to us and call forth in us courage and strength, and determination and love to walk in the footsteps of Jesus. A final note. When St. Paul could no longer reach his beloved community of Philippi. He was in his 60s. He probably was in Ephesus. He might have been in Rome. He sat down and he wrote them a letter, and it would be his farewell letter to that beloved community. And it ends with these words: "Rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I say rejoice." Not because life was easy or good for them in the midst of the calamity of their personal experience in Philippi, the uncertainty, the upheaval, the distress, which we can mark even in our own time now. Rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I say rejoice, because thanksgiving is one of the great spiritual exercises to note, for what can I give thanks in my life? And in expressing that to God, open there a vehicle for the Spirit of God to lead and inspire the life that I live, this wonderful gift of life, short or whatever that it is, in thanksgiving. The words of Paul: "Rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I say rejoice. Let your gentleness be known to everyone. Do not be anxious about anything, but in everything by prayer and with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. And the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus." Thanks be to God.